Welcome to Tilt Shift Photography, the complete guide. My name is John Greengo, and I've got a very special class for you. I'm very excited about this one. I've been working on it for a long time, and I've got a fantastic class on everything to do with tilt shift photography. Now, to start with, this class is genre generic. We're going to be talking a little bit about everything in the world of photography. We'll be talking about architecture and product photography, landscape photography, portrait photography, and everything. I've used these for a lot of travel, which is a little bit of everything. So we're going to concentrate on a very wide variety of subjects here. What this class is I'm going to be teaching you how to take advantage of the many benefits that a tilt shift lens offers. This is not going to be a review of specific lenses. It is not a specific instruction on how to use one lens or one brand of lens. This is more on how to use the techniques that are available on all of these products. The goal here is to teach you all the techniques and show you how to solve problems and be more creative with these tilt shift lenses. Now, these are something that have been a big part of my photographic journey, you might say. I started doing this sort of movements and understanding this back when I was in college. We were required to use a 4x5 camera, and we had to do lens movements in the studio, and that's where I first learned about it. But then when I went into kind of more regular photography with a 35mm camera and then a digital, the tilt shift lens was always this esoteric, very strange. It's kind of the final frontier when you're discovering lenses. And not many people knew about them. There's a few people, architectural photographers, that had them, and that was kind of it. And so I was always kind of intrigued by it. And so about a decade ago, I bought my first one, which is the 24mm over here. Still have it, still working great. And I had a lot of fun. And I thought, I think I might want to teach a class on this someday. And the class kept getting put off. And I was like, I need more material. And so I ended up traveling to more than 15 different countries. I've been to multiple states, multiple national parks, taking these lenses. And so I have lots of experience, thousands and thousands of photos of all different types of material that is all been put into this class. Well, it's finally to come forward with the class. I've got a ton of material, and I've seen pretty much every video. I've read every article you can get your hands on. Unfortunately, about 90% of them just skim the surface of what is a lens and how does it do it. Actually, how to get into it and really fine tune it and how to take full advantage of it is just something I haven't really seen around very much. So this class is designed to be the best possible class for tilt shift photography. So let's dive in. Let me tell you what we're going to be doing in here. Got 4 general big sections. We're going to talk about shifting and then tilting and then combining the two of them together. And then we got a lot of other equipment issues to talk about some of the particular lenses and accessories that you want to be looking at and thinking about for this class. Now, stepping back for a moment, thinking about the creative process that is photography. We have technical sides, we have artistic sides, and we're working with equipment that sometimes limits us in what we can do. So this first list of things that you're seeing here are things that we work with in photography that we kind of have an infinite number of options. What subject you choose to be in the photograph, yes, that's infinite. Lighting, that is an infinite subject. You have artificial, natural lighting, all different types of sizes and colors and powers of light. You can do almost anything in the world you want with different types of lighting. The timing of subjects is very important, and cameras have a lot of controls for timing, whether it's fast motor drives, self-timers, intervalometers, sound triggers, motion triggers. There's all sorts of ways to trigger the camera. Shutter speeds, most cameras will go from 30 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second. Some cameras will go up to 32,000th of a second. You can do bulb as long as you want, so there's really an infinite number of shutter speeds. Subject placement, yeah, you can put your subject pretty much anywhere in the frame, and so you have free reign with these things. But there's another list of things that we work with in photography, and it's kind of dependent on certain physical limitations and physics. The depth of field, if you have a lens that shoots at 2.8 and you want to open it up all the way, well, that 2.8 aperture is going to give you a certain amount of depth of field that is controlled by physics, and there's nothing you can do about it. other than maybe choosing a different focal length lens that has a 2.8. Where you're standing. Well, yeah, we have drones, and in theory we could get a tall ladder, but we don't always have that opportunity when we're out working in the field. The angle of view that we have with a particular lens. We do have zoom lenses and different focal length lenses, but what you have in your bag might be limited to those 2 or 3 lenses that are there. Sometimes we have a hard time controlling the background. The orientation, yeah, we can stick our cameras horizontal or vertical, but as far as the shape and the aspect ratio, well, we're going to crop in and we're going to lose pixels for doing that. Well, tilt shift lenses allow us to be much more creative and have much more control over these second set of features here. And so the sphere of influence with a tilt shift lens is that it's going to give you more versatility, more control using these types of features. So let me walk you through some of the highlights in my mind. Depth of field. By tilting the lens down, we can get virtual infinite depth of field if it gets set right. So objects in the foreground to distant subjects can all be in focus with motion and sharpness looking exactly right. You can choose to have very shallow depth of field, but have it controlled in an unusual way, so only the subjects or subject or part of a subject that you want in focus will be in focus. Yes, you can do the fake miniature effect with a tilt shift lens. I get a little amused when people talk about tilt shift lenses. Oh yeah, they do the fake miniatures. Yes, they do. That is correct. We'll talk about it. I'll show you exactly how to do it, give you the formula, and show you lots of examples of it. But it is just one of many, many different things that these lenses do. And to speak of it absolute first about a camera would be like saying, well, what does a camera do? Well, it's a paperweight. Well, yeah, you can take pictures with it, but it's a nice paperweight. Yeah, it's true, but that's kind of not the primary purpose of it. But, you know, there's a lot of different options here. There are a lot of things that you can fake in Photoshop that make things look like a tilt shift lens or solves the problem of a tilt shift lens. But there are some things that you can do with a tilt shift lens that you cannot do with any software at all or any other equipment. And I'll explain about these and why they're very important later in the class. Now, the angle of view. Lenses have a particular angle of view, and when you stitch images together, you can increase that angle of view as well as increase the resolution and sharpness of the photograph. I learned in the early days about digital about stitching images together, and at that time there was a lot of talk about nodal points and special heads so that you can twist your camera just right. And now I realize that that isn't really the best way to shoot panoramics in many, many cases. And I'm going to be showing you how to do a much better job of that in this section. And you can do this in a variety of formats. And so I've always been a little cramped in, shall we say, by the 1:1.5 aspect ratio of these cameras. I like shooting square, I like shooting panoramic and verticals and 4x5s and 5x7s and all sorts of different shapes. And a tilt shift lens allows you those options to really fit the frame around your subject. Obviously, controlling perspective is one of the first reasons these lenses came around, is so that you wouldn't have these converging lines when you photograph buildings. Straight lines that are straight in the real world could end up being straight in your photograph. And this is a very easy, it's one of the first things we'll talk about. One of the things I love most about these lenses is the compositional freedom that it gives you. Now, this photograph, I think, was improved quite a bit by changing of position and shifting of the lens. I'll explain this as I go into the class, but sometimes you have an idea for a photograph, and in order to make that photograph come true, you need to be standing and have the camera positioned in a very particular spot. But sometimes that causes a problem with something else lined up in the photograph. This gives you an out. It gives you loosening up of the rules of how you get to line your shots up. You can play with distortion, whether you want to fix it or use it. It's up to you. It gives you more control over the look of your images and the feel of it. There's also some tricky things that you can do to solve some problems. So this flagpole right in the middle of the building. Well, I can go into Photoshop and try to clone it out, but there's a flag behind it that I don't have all the information I need to clone it out. Well, with a tilt shift lens and two specially taken photographs, you can eliminate that very easily. Now this did require some Photoshop skills, but it required a tilt shift lens on top of it. So combining the tools of photography. As I mentioned before, the aspect ratio, I felt cramped in by 1:1.5 at some times. I think it's a great format. I think it's the one I would choose if I had to choose just one. But sometimes I like to shoot vertical, but other times I want to fit an 8:10 frame, or maybe I want to shoot square. Love square. Used to own a Hasselblad and love that square image. And I also love panoramics. I think it really depends on the subject. And I like having my camera fit my subject's needs. And as I say, I really do love those square images. And sometimes if you want to create a really high quality square image, there's a number of ways to do it with getting a very high resolution image by stitching images together. Now, because you can move this all around, there is a whole collection of stitch images that you can create. You can almost create this circular image. There's a lot to work with when you understand all the different combinations. And I'm going to show you some of my favorite combinations for stitching and the types of problems that they're going to solve in this class. Even the background. In this particular case, I didn't like some of the light that was coming through in the upper left-hand corner. I was able to shift my position, shift the lens, and fix that problem of where that light was coming in. And so I can even control the background with a tilt shift lens. If I'm in the frame and I don't want to be in the frame because the reflection in the mirror, I can move it off to the side and still have the subject lined up exactly in the same manner. And so these are all some of the tricks that you're going to figure out on the tilt shift lens. And maybe the best is when you want to create a massive, high resolution, high quality picture. By combining these stitched images combined with the tilt mechanism of the lens, you can get incredible sharpness on an incredibly large image. And so there's a lot of ways that the normal rules of photography now are slightly bent for you. You've expanded the size of your sandbox that you get to play in when you're working with a tilt shift lens. So let's go through some of the tilt shift basics. All right, so shifting moves the lens side to side or up and down. There'll be some controls for that. Then there's separate controls for tilting the lens, and they can tilt up and down, kind of like a nod here. You can rotate the lens and you can tilt it off to the side as well. Now you can also combine these features, and they're not actually combined all that often. There's more of just a few special situations that you'll need to combine them. But a well-built modern tilt-shift lens will allow you to do this in independent ways. So you can do one movement and then do another completely independent movement. Now, not all lenses are the same. Some lenses have restrictions and you can't do one type of movement with the other type of movement. So once again, this is not an instruction on specific lenses. You're going to need to know your equipment well for how this works. So the tilt shift lens, we have tilting, which is going to be to change the plane of focus. Where is the focus? And we're going to do this generally for two reasons. Either we want to maximize the depth of field, how much is in focus, or we want to minimize it and have very little in focus so that the eye is drawn to what is in sharp focus. The shifting portions, generally going up and down, but they can go side to side just as easily. This is usually done for perspective control. For instance, if you're shooting architecture and you have a building up above you, this can correct for those straight lines. You can also use it for photo stitching. And I've got a large section on that, on how you can stitch images side by side or top and bottom, and a whole bunch more options, putting them together to create higher resolution images. Now, the reason tilt shift lenses exist is because, well, not everyone's using a large format camera anymore. Back in the days where real photographers used large format cameras, tilt shift and all of that was just part of the camera. Every camera had it for the most part. And so there were field cameras which were designed to be a little bit smaller, lighter weight, pack up a little bit smaller, and you could take them out in the field, and they generally had a little bit more limitations on how much movement they could have with the shift and the tilt. The monorail cameras were generally designed for the studio. They're a little bit more bulky, but they also allowed for a little bit more versatile movements with the lens. Now, as we went to smaller and smaller cameras, they couldn't really use these types of movements in the smaller cameras, and that's why we have tilt shift cameras today. So let's look a little bit more closely at that large format camera. So there's generally going to be a base that everything is mounted to. We have a front standard where our lens mounts in, and you could mount in lots of different lenses. Our rear standard, which is going to hold our film plate, 4x5, 8x10, or possibly some other size. And then we're going to have kind of this accordion bellows that keeps the whole inside of it dark so that your image can be projected onto your film properly. So when you are shifting a lens, it was the front standard that would move up and down, that you could do that type of movement. Now you can also do it from side to side. Now traditionally on large format cameras, it was called a rise and fall, bringing it up and down, and moving it from side to side was considered a shift. And now we've kind of used the term shift to mean any sort of movement where the lens stays in that plane and just moves up and down, left or right. But if you want to use rise or fall, that's fine as well. With the tilt, we are tilting the front lens. We can tilt it up, we can tilt it down. Now, if we did it off to the side, those were generally called swings. And once again, we've kind of consolidated the terminology and we call everything a tilt no matter which direction. So you can tilt it up and down or left and right. If you want to call it a swing, that's fine, but most people are calling it a tilt. Now, the types of lenses that we are using these days, probably dominated by Canon. Canon's it is the most popular brand. They have the largest collection of tilt-shift lenses, so they have 5 of these lenses. Now, I personally own 4 of them, have owned at least one of them for a decade, owned the others for several years, and have traveled with them quite a bit. They each have their own personality. These are some of the best ones out on the market because they allow for independent control of the shifting and the tilting. So you can tilt down, you can shift up, or any combination you want therein. They also have quite a range of movement in them as far as how much you can shift and how much you can tilt. And so I imagine a lot of the people watching this class are going to be using the Canon tilt shift classes. And we'll talk more about some of the lens recommendations at the end of the class when we get to some of the equipment issues that we'll be talking about there. Now, the second most popular grouping would be the Nikon lenses, and they've had a long history. In fact, they're the first company to have a perspective control or tilt shift style lens in the past. And they have 4 lenses, and they have a great collection. They're really nice. I was actually just out last night shooting with the Nikon and the 85 tilt shift, very sharp lens, very good. Those do not have the independent movements that the Canons do. And so shifting and tilting, you kind of have to choose. If you're going to use both of them at the same time, you kind of have to choose one or the other because there's limitations on the rotating. You can't independently rotate the shift as well as the tilt on it. And so this is just kind of a standard that has been raised in the photographic game where cameras and lenses are having more and more capabilities. The optical quality of all of these from Canon and Nikon are vastly superior to what was available 30, 40, 50 years ago, and that's improving across the board with all the other brands as well. Now, the first thing that you'll notice on tilt-shift lenses is that there's a lot of controls and there's a lot of ways that they can look depending on how things are rotated. So for somebody who's new to photography, these are some very strange beasts that they are looking at. So let's break down one of these lenses to show you what's going on. Now, all of the tilt-shift lenses that I know of to date, and I say to date very much strongly because that could change in the near future here, all of these are manual focus. And so we're going to have things to deal with focusing. And this particular lens is the Canon 50mm lens. This is the lens that I have on my camera right now as kind of my demo piece here. A good general all-around piece to use as a reference piece. We're going to have tilting aspects and controls and then shifting controls. Now, there are a lot of lenses out there that will only do one of these things. I should say between tilting and shifting. That is, they will just do the shifting. So it'll do perspective control but won't do the change with the focusing. And so be aware that when you're looking at lenses to buy, some of them do shifting, some of them do shifting and tilting. I haven't seen any that do just tilting, but it's possible that I might have missed something out there. And all of these are going to be manual focus. And so having a nice big manual focus ring is nice, especially one that's got a very smooth control like this has on it. That's a good benefit in there. So first thing you want is you want nice, smooth focusing. Look for a big focusing ring. You're going to want a focusing scale and a focusing index on there so that you know where to focus and where things are. Sometimes you might need to be manually referencing this. Now, this particular Canon lens is also classified as a macro lens. It goes 1:2 in its close-up capability, and so it's going to have its reproduction ratio also listed on the lens. And so if we have it turned up here, you'll see that there are marks in white for meters, green for feet, and in yellow is your magnification mark. And so if you extend it all the way, it's going to be 1:2 macro capability right there. And so not all lenses will do that. That's one of the higher end, better quality ones. And then if it's a good lens, it'll have a hyperfocal scale. And this is something that we'll talk about in the focusing section, because knowing and understanding hyperfocal distance is really important. It can be very tricky setting the right point. And I'm going to give you a number of tools later on in this class on how to set the hyperfocal point so that you can do your tilting more easily on the lens. Next up, let's look at some of the tilting functions of this. So the big knob here is for making that tilt yourself. There will be a lock on the other side, and there'll be a tilt scale on either side because you rotate these lenses around, and it's kind of good to keep check on where you tilt things, because the more you use your lens, the more you'll learn about what sort of tilt you need to do different types of focusing. There'll be a lock knob so that things can lock in so they stay in where you want them to be. And on this particular lens, it's actually got a lock button. Because tilting has a very big impact on your final image, and a lot of people will use these as just standard prime lenses for a good portion of their photography. They can lock their lens in to a 0 tilt. That way, nothing funny is going on with the focusing in that regard, and they can kind of know that it's in a nice, safe place in that regard. And then there's a rotation lock on this particular one, and I'll show you that here in just a moment, where you can rotate just the tilting portion as opposed to the shifting portion of the lens. Next up on this lens are the shift controls. We have a large knob for moving the shift up and down, left and right, however you want it to go. There'll be a lock knob, so once again, it stays in the right spot. There'll be a scale so that you know how much you're shifting. Can be very helpful with panoramics and can be helpful with the tripod that you use as well when you're stitching images together. And I'll be explaining that when we do talk about the panoramics in the class. And then there is a shift rotation lock on this particular lens so that you can rotate the whole shifting mechanism, so that will allow you to shift in any direction that you want. Now, the other controls that you'll see here on most lenses, the mount index, so you know where to mount it up. A lot of these lenses will have hoods, not all of them, especially some of the ultra wide ones. It's recommended that you use the lens hood, make sure that it doesn't interfere with any of your other shifting movement or tilting movements. It's possible to get vignetting when you go to some extreme settings on some lenses, so be aware of that. Many of these lenses will allow you to use filters, so if you want to use polarizers or neutral densities or anything else in there, you usually can. Once again, you may need to be aware when you do extreme movements that you're not actually catching some of the edge of the filter if you have a thick filter on there at all. So let me show you around this 50mm lens here that I got as a demonstrator on here. And so up on top of this, you can see that we have a very big knob up here. Down at the bottom is the lock, and so I can lock it so that it doesn't turn. And if I turn this, I can swing it to the left and I can swing it to the right. And if I find a position that I like it in, I can lock it in with this little twist lock down here on the bottom, and it will stay locked in at that position. Let me rotate the lens so maybe you can see it a little bit better down here. So here's the lock. Now, folks, I'll just kind of take a moment here. These lenses can break very easily. They're really well built, but these knobs need to be handled with the right care. If you buy a tilt shift lens, you need to be really careful if you loan it out to a friend. They need to have really clear understanding of how it works. I worked in a rental shop one time myself, and I was actually just talking to a rental shop, some folks down there, and I was just asking about the tilt shift lenses. And they said that they are constantly getting broken because people are renting them who don't know a lot about them, and they're kind of forcing the knobs in one direction or another. And so they have a blanket statement that they basically have a $500 charge if it needs a repair. These things are very expensive. I bought a used lens that I think had some problems when I bought it, didn't realize it, and it needed a repair shortly after I got it, and I think it was around $300. And so it is very expensive repairs. So when it comes to these locking knobs and the shifting knobs, you want to be very careful about things. And so when you tighten something, just finger tight. It doesn't need to be cranked. It just needs to be, okay, that's as much as my little fingers want to tighten it. I'm not going to try to get my knuckles in there and really jam it shut. I'm just going to tighten it as long as it needs to be. And one of the problems that I find is that these knobs kind of go the other direction and they get locked in the open position really hard. And so it should either be finger tight or a little loose. That's all you need. So be very careful with these lenses. All right, and so if I find my position, I can lock it in finger tight and maybe just a tad more, and then it's going to stay there. Now if I put it into this middle position right here, I can push the lock forward, and I got to get it right in the position there, and so that it's right at the middle. And so now I guess I can finger tighten, but it doesn't matter turning this knob on it because it's completely locked in there. Now, as far as the shift mechanism, I have a lock over here, and it's currently unlocked. Let me just finger tight locking it, and so it won't go up and down. And so now if I loosen it up just a little bit, I can raise the lens up and drop it down. Now, if I didn't want to drop it down, there is a, let me see if I can rotate this around so everyone can see this. There's a little release lock here, and this allows us to rotate the lens. And so we can rotate this, and it gets a little hard here, so I got to get my finger in here, over 180 degrees. It does not go 360 degrees. And so if I want it to go up, I need to move the lens over, press in the release, and now I can go up. And so up and down, and it's got a 180 direction that it can rotate around. Let's see, there we go. Now, one of the things you do need to be very careful of is if you are using a crop frame camera, I suppose it could be a full frame camera, it doesn't really matter, but a camera with a built-in flash that extends out over the top. It's possible that you could hit the top of your camera, the flash that extends out, or any other device that you might have mounted on there with the shift lens. And you have to be careful about things in this area because that's where the lens is moving in there. So if I wanted to do a shift up or down, that's very easy. I can rotate it in any direction. Now this particular lens, let's give it a little bit of a tilt here. I got to unlock it. There we go. And let's just give it a little bit of a tilt. Now if I didn't want that tilt going down, I could press this other lever here, and I'm just spinning the tilt portion of this lens. And if I want to go the other direction, I can get it anywhere I want by tilting around in different areas. Now I may need to rotate the lens all the way around into a different area to get to the right place. And so once you get familiar with these controls, it'll be more intuitive. Generally speaking, one of the most important things I think is whenever you're done shooting is to return everything to the normal and standard position. That way, when you get up for your next shot, you can think straight, everything's straight and normal, and then you can make those adjustments from there on out. And so I like to return things to the middle positions, and you can see over here on the side, get it to the middle, give it a little finger tight, and so it's locked in there. Let's make sure we're locked in here. We're going to be, I don't want to lock it right now because we're going to be doing a lot of playing around in here. So that's some of the basics of the tilt shift lens in this particular model. Now it's going to be a little bit different when you jump onto a Nikon, and I'm not going to go through all of them because this isn't a review on all the lenses, but you need to be very familiar with your camera and your lenses as we go through this class. All right, there are some disadvantages with tilt shift lenses. Let me tell you, Yep, they're larger than a normal lens. They're relatively expensive, yes. That's what they are because they're unique lenses. There's a lot of mechanics going on. They're challenging to make. They're not sold in large numbers, and so they're going to be expensive. These are manual focus only right now. There's rumors of an autofocus model that'll be out sometime in the future. We'll see how well that works. It's not a big deal in my mind. These are very slow and deliberate process that you generally use here. But I know as soon as they add autofocus, someone's going to find a way to take advantage of it and use it for their photography. And that's probably a good thing. They have a relatively slow maximum aperture, for a big 50 millimeter lens like this being only a 2.8. Well, some of the others are 1.4 or 1.2. And that's just what they are in order to have all these different other lens movements. They are fixed focal length. Yes, but there's a lot of ways that when you stitch images together, you use teleconverters or extenders. There's ways of expanding what you have here. And so it's part of the nature of what they are, but it's really not a big hindrance in my opinion. Probably the biggest problem is that they are challenging to use. If you give a tilt shift lens to an educated, well-rounded photographer who has no experience, they're going to have a hard day. You need understanding of how these things work and how to make them, how to get the most out of them. And so they can be very hard to use for somebody. It's the type of thing that you buy, you go out shooting a few different times before anything important happens so that you know how to really use the lens properly. But that's what the class is for. And so after this class, they're not going to be challenging to use. Now, as we dive forward, I'm not going to talk too much about exposure, but it is an important issue and it varies really depending on the lens and the camera you have. Generally speaking, when you move a lens off to the side or tilt it from side to side, it's going to change the amount of light coming into the camera and it may throw off your light meter. And so there are certain things that you may need to do with your equipment in order to get the right exposure. Mirrorless cameras, DSLRs, when used in their live view mode, have simplified this tremendously. Almost all of my shooting on tilt shift comes with an SLR and using the live view on the back of the camera. I'm now moving more to mirrorless, and it's just kind of through the viewfinder or on the back of the camera, very easy to use. But with DSLRs, I would typically use the live viewfinder to see exactly what I was getting in the exposure. And so live view, exposure preview, all of that on with DSLRs in most all cases. Manual exposure is going to be best. That's what I use almost exclusively. There's probably some scenarios that you can come up with where maybe aperture priority might work out well, but I would say that manual exposure is probably going to be best on these in most all cases. If we're doing a stitched panorama, a multi-shot image, you want to have all of those in a manual exposure as well. Because they're all going to become part of one image. They should all have the same shutter speed, the same ISO, same shutter speed, and that's because it's all becoming one photograph. And so just think of that as we go through the rest of the class, because we're going to be concentrating really on the lenses as we go forward from there. Now, some general advice. Your two best friends when it comes to tilt shift photography is the tripod and time. Now, I like to skirt the rules as much as anyone, and I have shot a lot of stuff handheld, and with some of the modern cameras that have built-in stabilization, it allows us to use tilt shift lenses in all sorts of scenarios. But if you can use a tripod, if you can have more time to set up your shot, there's a lot of things that need to be set very precisely. And having the tripod allows you to be very precise about things, checking on focus, which can be very tricky in some situations. And so that's what works best with tilt shift. Having said that, yep, go ahead, shoot a wedding with a tilt shift lens. You're going to get some very unique, potentially great images. Just be well versed in what you're doing if you're going to be avoiding either the tripod or time. It seems that tilt shift lenses were really designed around architectural photographers, people shooting landscapes, and product photography. And so if these are some of the main things that you shoot with in photography, a tilt shift lens is going to prove itself to be, in most all cases, an invaluable tool. And this is, as I say, this is kind of why they were designed, to address the professional needs of these types of photographers. But the fact of the matter is that pretty much everyone has found how to use these lenses to help do their type of photography. And so I think this is fantastic. The 90, the 135 for food photography, anyone doing commercial work who has to meet a wide variety of needs and desires, I think is really going to be helped out with a tilt-shift lens. Travel may not seem like the first place for it, but it is something that I've used in travel photography and is awesome. I love being able to travel with the tilt-shift lens. I do need that extra spot because it's not the first lens I take with me in most cases, but it is a lens that allows me to do something unique and different in solving problems. But there's pretty much every genre of photography where the lens has been used to great effect. Probably the least would be wildlife photography, but there are special situations, and I'll show you at least one wildlife shot in here that was captured with the tilt-shift lens that really couldn't have been done with any other lens. And so it's all a matter of your ideas, your creative thoughts, and how you can apply the tools and techniques in this class to your genre of photography. Now, the benefits to the tilt-shift lens are the quality. First up, it's a great quality lens, very sharp. If you just want to shoot it as a prime lens, it's going to be a great lens. The control that it gives you over your subject, as I say, it's kind of this bending of the rules that you get here. The creativity is probably my favorite aspect, is that it now allows you a greater level of creativity in deciding, well, I can stand over here, or I can stand over here. Well, I don't want it to look like this, so now I can stand over here, and I can fix this problem that I didn't like over there, and now I can have the right composition. And so I think that's another big benefit, is the compositional control that you have here. And so if you are finicky about your compositions, if you are finicky about your sharpness and every detail of your image, that's the type of person who's going to really enjoy a tilt-shift lens. Now, who is this class for? Obviously anybody who owns a tilt-shift lens. If you're trying to figure out how to get the most out of this, yep, I'm going to try to show you 100 different ways to use this lens and master all the different features in it. If you are new to tilt-shift photography, this class is going to be essential for really helping you through all the different steps to control all the different aspects of this. Now, there might be some of you who don't own a tilt-shift lens. Maybe you've used one or played with one a little bit, and you might be thinking about it. Well, this class will show you how to do it, and then towards the end of it, I'll give you a little bit of buying advice and some thoughts on different lenses towards it there. But I think that it'll be very helpful to show you what's capable. Now, I also think this class is going to be really good for anyone who's just really interested in photography. If photography is your passion and you want to understand it, well, maybe you will and maybe you won't own a tilt-shift lens one of these days. But I plan to explore the full range of things in this class so that you can really see how much is possible in here. So, as I say, I've broken this class down into 4 major sections and broken those further up into subcategories in there. So when we go through shift, we're going to talk about all the different aspects of shift, why you'd want to use it, how you actually set it up in the field to get it right. We'll talk about stitching images together. And then at the end, in the shift conclusion section, I'm going to have a test for you. That's right, a little bit of a quiz. I'm going to show you photos and I'm going to ask you what type of movement was done and with what lens. And I'm going to expect that by that time, you're going to know this topic well enough, you'll be able to just look at a photograph, tell me the lens that was used, and tell me the type of shift that was used on that image to get it to look like that. And so once you go through this, I think you're going to know shift movements really well. Next up is tilting. So we're going to be controlling focus here. And there's a lot to talk about. We're going to need to talk about hyperfocal distance and aperture sharpness and getting maximum depth of field, and then how you exactly go about the tilt aspect of this. And this is one of the most difficult things in tilt-shift photography, is when you're tilting forward to get the full landscape in focus, for instance, how do you really focus? Because there's tilting and there's focus. And when you focus, it changes your tilt. And when you tilt, it changes your focus. And so you can end up in this just circle of confusion of where you're trying to get things set and you just can't get things set. And so I have a couple of formulas and techniques, processes to show you so that you can get it right out in the field quickly and easily. And at the end of that, I'm going to give you another quiz. What lens was used for the tilt and what type of tilt was done? You'll be able to look at the photographs and hopefully you'll be able to ace the test, get all the questions right. All right, next up, we'll do tilt and shift together. As I say, you don't actually use this all that often, but I'm going to show you some examples on how to use it and how to get the most of it. And finally, in equipment, we'll talk about the available lenses. We'll talk about the different focal lengths. I've used pretty much all the focal lengths, and as I say, I've owned the 17 to the 90 for years now. I'll give you some thoughts on who's going to benefit most from different types of lenses, and sometimes when it's handy to have two different lenses, we'll talk about using teleconverters and extension tubes and why I have an L bracket on my camera and all sorts of other equipment related issues there at the end. So folks, there you go. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to tilt shift. Hang on to your hats because we got a lot to go through in this class.